the different techniques. So I put it as just a recall. So this is the different terms that I mentioned a while ago. While in terms of the probability sampling, we have here the well-known, the SRS, or the simple random sampling, systematic, stratified, and then the cluster. So in the mixed kind of sampling, this is a multi-stage, sometimes a multi-phase, or the lot quality assurance sampling, or the LQAS. Okay, so yan. So yung example ko kanina ng pyramiding. So on the type of sampling where randomness is considered or a priority, the SRS, so we can select our sample. Actually, the simple random sampling, sometimes called the lottery type of sampling. You just select sample, maybe you put your names or the names of the population inside the box and you pick it randomly. Sometimes we apply SRS with replacement, sometimes without replacement. So ito yung ginagawa natin sa raffle, sometimes with replacement, sometimes without a replacement. That is the SRS. Okay? While in the systematic approach, the systematic random sampling, so after we have the sample size, in order for us to select our sample, it is selecting every Kate or selecting every, in the illustration, every third member from the population. So how are we going to select every third? So meron pong ginagawa yung sorting, usually sorting according to their names, sorting according to their age or nationality or whatsoever. So the first is you apply the sorting and then you select the Kate member. So how are we going to select the Kate member or the every third, every second, every fourth? So there is also another consideration to compute the value of your K, so that it will be your guide to select whether if it is the second, the third, the fourth, and so on. Okay, and the third one type of the probability sampling is the stratified random sampling. So the stratified random sampling, from the original set of population, you divide it into a subgroup or what we call the strata. Sometimes meron tayong tinatawag na geographical divisions. For instance, in a university, meron na talaga siyang divisions. You divide it according to college. And if it is a college, maybe you can divide it according to its program or courses. And the selection of samples through stratification. So meron tayong ginagamit dito na stratified random sampling, proportional allocation. That's the common. Proportional allocations in the sense, the collection of samples from each strata will depend upon the proportion of your sample size. So for instance, you divide this stratum 1 or strata 1 to the population, stratum 2 to population, so determine the proportions of each strata, and then multiply it to your computed sample size. Okay, in order for you to determine the sample size per strata. Okay. And the fourth one, the cluster sampling, sometimes called the area sampling. So it's a bit similar to the stratified random sampling. The only difference is after you divide the population into subgroup, in cluster sampling, so you randomly select each group, or depende minsan, let's say the 2 or 3 depends on the volume. or from your computed sample size. So the only difference from the stratified is in cluster, you select all inside the group. So for instance, here, if you have this group of people inside this box, in cluster sampling, you're going to select all of this, and the second one, you're going to select all of this. Unlike in the stratified, you select sample from each of these groups. There's a difference, simple difference between the cluster and the stratified random sampling. Okay, so for question between the non-probability and then the probability sampling. Do we have problems on that encountered sa nung gumagawa tayo ng research? And another thing, another consideration in, please be careful with this. This is also common dun sa na-encountered ko sa mga nagpapastat in relation to their objectives and then the sampling. On their objective, may nakalagay measuring the differences, measuring the relationship of the different variables. But when you check the sampling process, as I mentioned kanina, so ang sinabi lang, pwede na yung 30, pwede na yung 50. It means without any proof, without any considerations, paano nag-arrive dun sa sample size. And the worst is, hindi natin na-consider paano na-select, let's say, given that the sample size is 30, paano na-select yung 30? Is it a probabilistic or non-probabilistic approach? Because if the sampling process is non-probabilistic, magsasuffer po yung inference, yung question na differences and question na relationship. Yes, you can measure that, but in terms of reliability, it's very low. That's why we discourage that type of sampling. If you wanted to have such kind of objectives, measuring the relationship and measuring the differences, make sure that the techniques that you're going to apply is through probability sampling for you to have a higher results of in terms of reliability. And of course, the accuracy and precision. So yun po yung isang paalala dun sa mga naglalagay dun sa objective ng ganong measuring the relationship, measuring the differences, pero ang ginamit na design, sampling technique, nakalagay pa doon purposive. So it's a big no. Nakalagay doon is quota, another big no. So make sure you apply a probabilistic approach. Well, if you are just measuring the characteristics, you're just describing through the analysis of means, through variances. So either either probabilistic or either non-probabilistic, pwede po yan. But once you have the inferential questions, make sure you apply a probabilistic form of sampling. Okay, so moving on to the next, aside from the probabilistic and the non-probabilistic, the third one is the mixed. So the mixed sampling, so we have three. The first one is the multi-stage. So this is common. Ito yung kalimitang ginagamit ng mga researchers. Hindi lang nila alam na yung ginamit nilang sampling is a multi-stage. Sabi nila, anong ginamit mong sampling? How do you select your sample size? So from the population, sabi niya, dinivide niya into subgroups. and then from the groups, another form of another sampling. So a combination of different samplings. So the usual example of this is a cluster and a combination of stratified. So first, you divide the population into subgroups. And then since malaki yung, let's say, Quezon Province, masyadong malaki yung geographical location, you just select 3 municipalities, for instance. And then from the municipalities, you again, so they were selected through clusters. And then from these 3, you apply maybe another cluster, or maybe you apply stratification. You stratified within A, stratified within B, and then we stratify within C, so that you have a well representation to these 3. So pwede po yun, the multi-stage. Ang wag lang po natin siguro gawing practice yung in the multi-stage, at first you apply the probabilistic. But on the latter part of the collection, you apply judgment for purposive or convenience. So medyo nakakalungkot dun sa sampling. So make sure when you apply the multi-stage, so focus on the probabilistic. Kung hindi talaga kaya, then you go to, kasi costly po ang probabilistic. You really have to interview or ask yung specific individual na nakuha mo doon sa sample. Okay? Pero kung hindi naman talaga kaya, then you go to the non-probabilistic. So kung sa multi-stage, yung sinasabi natin kanina, you apply quota, and then the second one, you apply now the convenience or true judgment. So pumapasok na siya doon sa tinatawag nating multi-stage sampling. One moment lang po ha, medyo inom lang po ako. Ayun. Okay, next. The next example is the multi-phase. Actually, this method is a bit similar. So in this method, part of the information is collected from the whole sample and a part from the subsample. So still we have from the population, and then the second one, you have now the sample size. So for this illustrative example, in this application, halimbawa, in a school health survey, the population considered all students in that particular school. So lahat ng estudyante examine. Okay? While for the second one, then from this population, only the ones with oral health problems, yung kailangan lang. Okay? So naka-multi-phase ka na. So the second phase now is yung lahat lang ng mayroong oral problems, yung original nating population, all students. Okay? And then from that, all students with oral problems, we can still select another form of sample, let's say, according to their age. So yun po yung approach na ganon, tinatawag na natin siyang multi-phase. So we didn't apply stratification on that because the sample size or the groups of individual is predetermined na po siya. Okay? Unlike in the multi-stage, regardless whether kung yan ay mayroong oral problem o wala, basta nasama ka dun sa grupo, then you're part of the sample. Okay? And the third type under the mix So this is common in, I think, in food tech. Do we still have food tech? Food and beverages. Sa engineering courses, I think applicable pa rin tong quality assurance sampling. Sa agriculture, yes, applicable po yung quality assurance. Kasi yung the selection of samples here is, for instance, you have these divisions as illustrated here, and then from that divisions, you determine yung tinatawag nating acceptable or not acceptable, defective or not defective. Actually, binary lang po yung results natin sa LQAS. Okay? So, yung batch lang nung, so halim kasi kung gusto natin is yung effectiveness, so sometimes we just collect yung good and you examine this good results further on the next batch. So, they are just interested dun sa batch or maybe a lot or maybe collection of goods. So, as I mentioned, this is just a binary in nature. Yung defective, not defective, yung acceptable or not acceptable, yung possible outcome. So, itong kind of sampling na mix na to is not that high in terms of cost compared to the multi-phase and then the multi-stage sampling. Okay, so any question so far on the sampling technique? And again, still this formula of sample size. Maybe you can copy this or you can screenshot this formula. This is very important. Actually, the Sloven's formula originated from this. So paano siya nag-arrive sa Slovenes? Medyo mahaba po, medyo technical na po yung pag ipapakita pa natin yung derivation. But yung essence is the Slovenes, nag-originate po siya dito. So ano yung kaibahan ng Slovenes and then the SRS, sample size determination? So this is SRS. So Slovenes formula is applicable only, of course, measuring the population proportion when the confidence interval or the relative error or what we call the tolerable error. So the confidence interval is around 95%. So meaning the error is just around 5%. And at the same time, the population proportion, well, actually, the P here is the proportion. So the population proportion is close to 0.5. So two considerations, the confidence coefficient is around 95%. This one, the 1 minus alpha percent, that is your confidence coefficient. If it is 95% and the proportion is close to 0.5, you can apply Slovenes. But other than that, because sometimes pag masyado ng malaki yung ating population, we try to either increase or decrease yung ating confidence coefficient. Maybe around 94, 93, so binababa po yan. But the standard is around 95. If you are very sure, then you can use the 99% with 1% error. Okay? So again, this formulation of sample size, N, consider the population size. So P, and the other formulation, this is PQ, where Q defined as the 1 minus P, or the sample proportion divided by the NE squared plus the Z. In a standard normal distribution, when confidence coefficient is 95%, the value of Z is fixed to 1.96 at 95% confidence level or coefficient. That is 1.96.